Right now is Ukraine on the brink of even more violence and an international standoff. Now NATO getting involved. We have our expert here to dissect the very latest. And then the NYPD has closed its unit that has profiled Muslims since 9/11. It turns out going rafting with Muslim students, all undercover, yielded zero leads. But did the department also break the law? Well, our legal team will sound off. And New York's former Lieutenant Governor Dick Ravitch says that current Governor Andrew Cuomo was playing dirty with David Patterson. We're going to unpack that bombshell and what it also says about how this governor plays politics. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French, and thank you so much for joining us this Wednesday evening, April 16th. And tonight, we begin with a look at the escalating situation in the Ukraine. Today, NATO Secretary General vowed to increase security to help defend Eastern allies, growing concern over the surge in violence.
We will have more planes in the air, more ships on the water, and more readiness on the land.
The U.S. and other allies have already sent more planes and ships to the region. Obama administration working on a non-lethal aid package here for the Ukraine. It would include things like medical supplies, clothing. Administration says not actively considering sending weapons or ammunition. Now this all despite a move by Russia that the Pentagon called both provocative and unprofessional. The scene from Saturday, a Russian fighter jet made multiple close-range passes near an American warship in the Black Sea for more than 90 minutes after being constantly told to stand down. This speaks to the escalating tensions in the region. And today, pro-Russian insurgents in the eastern portion of Ukraine took over 6 Ukrainian armored vehicles along with their crews. They then raised Russian flags over those vehicles. Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany and other leaders here have for weeks said that they will follow tougher sanctions on Russia. However, New York Times reporting they will also be cautioning behind closed doors that a serious rupture in business and other ties could take years to heal. Germany depends on Russia for up to 40% of its natural gas. Okay, this situation playing out, and trust me, if anybody at home says, oh, that's Eastern Europe, why do I care? Well, trust me, if you give me this segment, you'll see why you should. Let's bring in our panel now. Dominic Carter, of course, political journalist and author. Andrew Whitman, our senior political correspondent, easy for me to say, and assistant professor of national security and political science at the University of New Haven, as well as a contributor to the Matters Military blog hosted by the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs. Matthew Schmidt here. Thank you for joining us, and not to puff you up too much here, but the best guy we've had on to talk about this and put into user-friendly terms what's going on there, what might happen, and why this all matters so much. Okay, since we last spoke, there seems to be an escalation of sorts, and it almost depends on who's wearing what uniforms, who feels comfortable with whom, and explain how the actors maybe haven't have changed, but appearances have, and why tensions are rising.
Well, tensions are rising right now because around a dozen cities in eastern Ukraine have significant government buildings that are either currently under control of pro-Russian forces or have been in the last few days. So that's the situation. There was also one death a couple of days ago of a civilian, apparently, and there was also a death of a Ukrainian military officer attempting to remove some of these pro-Russian forces in the city of Slavyansk. Slavyansk appears to be right now the center of what's going on in eastern Ukraine. So that's the situation on the ground. That's why tensions are rising. At the same time, you have about 40,000 Russian conventional forces around the border of eastern Ukraine on the Russian side, but around the border, and you have, as you saw in the earlier clip, as Secretary Rasmussen said, we now have increased forces being called up in NATO.
Professor, talk about why it's important, 2 different things, and they may sound like inside baseball, but the significance of Ukrainian forces defecting and siding up with the Russians, and moreover, the fact that we haven't seen armed conflict yet, and the type of troops that Putin sent into the Ukraine, because it's not just general issue army. These are, in effect, the elite units that went in because they probably wouldn't fire off shots, right?
Right, so a couple things. People ask, when do you think war is going to break out? My response to this, as someone who has taught military operations planning, is to say war is already happening. It's not the kind of war we tend to think about. It's unconventional. But I think it's already there. Interestingly enough, right now, with the events in eastern Ukraine, the US government is even saying, Secretary Kerry is saying, that there are Russian agents in eastern Ukraine. We avoided directly stating that in Crimea, but right now everybody's saying there are clearly Russian officers or Russian agents, intelligence agents operating there. And what they are doing is basically organizing and then buttressing existing local forces. It may well turn out in a future history of these events that the Ukrainian officer that was killed in Slavyansk was killed by Russian special forces who were occupying that building. We don't know now, I'm speculating, but this is the kind of situation that your viewers should be thinking about when they're thinking about this right now, that this is active warfare. And I would say it's unlikely to move towards conventional warfare because that's sort of a lose-lose situation for both sides here. As far as defections on the Ukrainian side, at this point I downplay those a good deal. What I've been reading, what I've been hearing, is that those defections largely had to do with the state of Ukrainian military preparedness and the fact that these soldiers were apparently quite hungry and thirsty. Yeah. And that it was sort of those reasons, right, needing to be fed, needing to be housed and taken care of, that they stepped out of their tanks and sort of said, this isn't worth it for us.
You're a student of history here, and I mentioned the Russian jets doing flybys by the American destroyer, and how some of the tensions rising in those. History has shown, hasn't it, that there could be single sparks that set off much bigger fires. And is that really one of the big concerns that's going on at the State Department right now, in the UN and at the EU, which is, geez, all it takes is one hot hit here to start firing off shots. We don't know where this thing could end.
Always. This is what Clausewitz called, right, the fog or the chaos of war. So any situation like that could become the catalyst for the next situation. And this is why the State Department, I think appropriately, called these kinds of actions provocative and irresponsible.
I mean, he came within 90 yards, guys, in the flyby. Imagine if he hit the control, hit the tower there, and we could have a completely different conversation tonight.
Isn't it possible that the U.S., piggybacking on Richard's question, could be pulled into this?
It's possible. It's unlikely. Let's imagine the thought experiment for a moment of what happens if that plane does, say, hit the control tower. What happens if we lose people, American servicemen, American sailors die in that kind of an incident? Right? It doesn't therefore follow that the United States has to declare war on Russia.
Is it at all clear to you what Putin is thinking about or what he's aiming at in all of this? Is it to try to destabilize that section of Ukraine to then justify an expansion of Russian forces into Ukraine in a similar fashion to the way he did in Crimea?
Or is it all about the oil?
Well, I wrote about this a couple weeks ago at the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs. I think that the outcome that Putin is looking for and that the provisional Ukrainian government is looking for is a political outcome. And that's what everybody has to understand. That the Russians are not trying to defeat and destroy the Ukrainian military, nor vice versa. They are trying to use judiciously armed force and the threat of force to control a political outcome somewhere around the presidential elections that will be happening on May 25th. The Ukrainian side is trying to do the same. And what that outcome is right now is, on the first hand, the Ukrainian side is trying to prevent this area from becoming annexed and becoming fully part of Russia. Somewhere in the middle, though, I think Putin probably would accept a degree in eastern Ukraine that was still controlled by Kiev nominally, but was functionally independent, such that it was meaningfully controlled by Moscow. And not legally controlled by Moscow, right? Still a part of Ukraine, but essentially run by powerful figures in Moscow.
Not to think way, way far ahead, but there is an opportunity for Western Europe to figure out a long-term alternative to Russia for oil if possible here. And if some people can be proactive enough and can think 3-4 steps ahead, this could spur some of the alternative conversations we're having about energy, et cetera, and whatever, because that's what's really holding back Germany and others from really doing full-fledged sanctions of the Russians, right?
There's been some interesting developments in that this week. So a German gas company has agreed to reverse flow on some of the lines and send gas from Germany into Ukraine. Apparently, Slovakia is considering doing this. And what's funny about this is there's irony is that a lot of that gas is actually Russian gas that the Germans then bought and paid for and stored and are now sending back because it's the summer months and they have excess in their storage tanks. I think the long-term situation is that yes, everybody's going to try to become more energy independent from Russia, but I still think at best that's 5 years away from a significant hit to the Russian energy economy, and 5 years an eternity in international relations.
In television, as they'll tell you, minutes aren't an eternity, and that, can you give me the short answer for that person at home saying, all right, fascinating, Professor, but tell me why I care here in the States?
Well, first of all, a democratic Europe and a democratic Ukraine is better for the United States. It's better for all democracies. But secondly, I think that in 5-6 years, you could wake up and see a dramatically different world energy market, a dramatically different gas market, and dramatically different gas prices because of the events that are happening right now in April 2014. Will make those prices very different in April 2020.
And let's hope cooler heads here prevail here, because we've seen through history just one stray shot can lead to totally different alternatives. Professor, as always, I really appreciate the time. Great as always. Okay, when we come back on RFL, a bombshell allegation from former Lieutenant Governor Dick Ravitch, Andrew Cuomo, then Attorney General, was undermining one David Patterson. We'll explain how Ravitch says this all happened, also analyze what that says about this governor when we come back.